Love drives these projects of rational reflection and of reason. My problem, Augustine concluded, was not my inability to reason, but my inability to love properly. Sometimes the agapic response is to be angry back, right? But sometimes the agapic response is to just, let them yell and scream at you.
And I say that life is indeed darkness, save when there is urge. And all urge is blind, save when there is knowledge. And all knowledge is vain, save when there is work. And all work is empty, save when there is love. All right, here we are, number 19. We took a brief detour to number 7 to recover more precision on some of the concepts that will be discussed here. And now jumping back in and continuing along our path to number 19. Do you want to take away the summary?
Yeah. All right, so lecture 19 is about St. Augustine and how he created what Vervaeke calls the three axes of meaning, and how this structure of meaning collapsed, and the work that Thomas Aquinas did to solve the resulting crisis. So Augustine lived around the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire and initially found the religion of Manichaeism compelling because it referenced this Gnostic notion of evil power structures that enmeshed and entrapped people, robbing them of agency. Now, living in a world that seemed to be coming undone as the Roman Empire was collapsing, this was probably a very powerful and attractive idea that seemed intuitively sensible to people of the time. But this evil seemed to Augustine to be a force unto itself, and in Augustine, he felt that it also manifested in his sexual addiction, which gave him a lot of inner conflict. In this context, he reads the work of Plotinus, and he has a mystical experience. He has a union with the One. And yet, despite this, afterwards, he succumbs again to his sexual proclivities. And this causes him to feel a lot of despair. Here he is, having achieved union with the One, described by Plotinus, and yet he still isn't good enough or cured of his sexual temptations. The idea of an evil force pulling him down solidifies within him, and he asks himself how he might be able to overcome such evil. This is when he finds and reads a version of the Bible and reads the work of Paul, in whom he recognizes the same kind of inner conflict that he was having, and he has an insight. What is the goal of all this philosophy? The end goal is to become more whole, more integrated, more one within ourselves, and also to achieve closer and closer contact with what is really real. This is what reason and rationality is all in service of. This is the ultimate Neoplatonic goal. And he asks himself, what motivates this goal? His insight was that it was love of oneness, both within and with reality. Love drives these projects of rational reflection and of reason. My problem, Augustine concluded, was not my inability to reason, but my inability to love properly anymore, to care deeply about the Neoplatonic goals of integration within and without. Augustine recognized within Christianity the potential of agape to help recover his lost capacity to love again. Now, this insight gives him the ability to integrate Neoplatonic and Aristotelian ideas. From Aristotle, he gets the notion of a nomological order, how we interact with and understand and live within our realities. And from Neoplatonism, he gets the notion of the good, and thus the normative order, a direction that we should be orienting our lives towards. We are to direct ourselves to align with the good. And how do we move up the dimension of the normative order towards the good? With agape. How should we try to establish our nomological order? By relating to our reality with agape. Agape could be centered in both of these processes. Now, for Augustine, Christian mythology is also able to situate and furnish these processes within a grand cosmic narrative. The way God comes down and intervenes in the affairs of humans from time to time, as he did by sending down his son to be sacrificed agapically for us. The fact that both the nomological and the normative order are ensconced in a grander cosmic story that end in a final consummation, like the promised land or paradise. all of this is informed and infused by agape, that capacity that Augustine felt was corrupted within him. This framework is the culmination of several centuries of thought that began with the axial revolution of the two worlds mythology. And let's recall that the fundamental structure of this mythology was that there were two worlds: the illusionary world that us unenlightened souls experience, and the real world. This mythology is refined in the Neoplatonic tradition as levels of reality when an ascent towards the good and the one, all of which were then incorporated by St. Augustine into a cohesive theological whole. This framework lasts for 1,000 years, and since we don't have it now, Vervaeke goes on to try to understand the genealogy of its demise. He goes on to make an argument that one of the reasons for its collapse was the way that reading changed. Up to that point, reading was done communally with a spirit of allowing the words that you were reading to imbue themselves within you, to flow through you, to let them change you. And often what was available to read during this time was the Bible or other spiritual texts, because that's all there was to read during these dark ages following the collapse of the Roman Empire. This was a way of reading where you conformed to the text. It was a participatory exercise. This was very much a Neoplatonic and a Gnostic way of regarding knowledge, of what it meant to know things. Knowing something was to be it. It was related to your being in a deep manner. But as the centuries passed, this changes. Aristotle's teachings, which had mostly been lost for centuries, is now rediscovered. The power of propositional thinking is rediscovered. Now, reading is done for another purpose. Reading is done to understand propositions and arguments, and the focus shifts away from reading being a process whereby a person might transform their being to thinking about coherence within propositions. This changes how we think and self-identify. We go from beings that are projectively and intimately connected to our cosmos, a so-called extensive self, to selves that base internal mental states as the foundation of our being. This way of reading and thinking is very problematic for Christianity, which up to this point, around the 13th century, was the sole basis of all knowledge and authority. And yet here you have, in the rediscovered Aristotle, giving us not only actual scientific theories that are not mentioned in the Bible, but also a way of thinking that was powerful, even if it was devoid of the Neoplatonic and Gnostic transformational power that knowledge and reading used to have. So Thomas Aquinas comes along and tries to diffuse this looming threat to Christianity by recalling the original axial revolution grammar, the two worlds mythology of the real world and the illusionary world. Aquinas said that the illusionary world, which is the physical world that we constantly inhabit, that world is also real. There are real truths that can be gleaned from this world. Let this world be the domain of Aristotelian science and propositional argumentation. Let's call this world the natural world. The real world, in the Platonic sense, is, however, more real, and it sits above the natural world. This is the supernatural world. And this supernatural world, where presumably God resides, cannot be accessed by methods of Aristotle, by science or argumentation, but by faith. And this is a faith in God. It is here where love resides. Our love of God asserts facts about this world that Aristotelian reason cannot give us. Reason is now confined to the natural world. This is where reason is most operant. Love belongs to the domain of God in the supernatural world. Now let's recall that for Plato, as St. Augustine realized, reason was driven by love. The move from the illusionary world to the real world was driven by love and accomplished with reason. There was a way to get from one world up continuously to the other, a way that was driven by love and managed with reason. With Aquinas, however, a division was starting to be formed. And as the world of propositions grew in strength over the following centuries, reason resided there. Reason no longer found a home in the supernatural world. Reason was now separated from love, which was the domain of the supernatural world. In the centuries that followed, science and spirituality are pulled apart. If a thing is spiritual or pertained to love, it was not the domain of science. And if it was scientific, it was not the domain of love or spirituality.
Great summary. Yeah, I think you've adequately hit all the points. And yeah, he covered quite a swath of time and ideas as well. So I think there's a lot to dive into, and I think for me, I want to get to that notion of reading because I think there's a lot to unpack there. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about the experience of Augustine and the episode of the fruit, and then his sexual addiction as well. He has this episode of stealing fruit as an adolescent, but he's more than trivially disturbed by it, because he recognizes in himself that it wasn't for the sake of wanting the fruit or wanting to impress his friends, but merely for the sake of wanting to do something wrong, wanting to do something evil. I think that becomes important. Certainly, I have experienced, and as I was reflecting on saying these things, actually, I realized how uncomfortable it is for me to even say this in such a public forum, right? But
here it comes.
But
Can't wait to hear this.
I have this. I have these same impulses. The impulses to do something just fucked up. Just I'm sitting minor things in sometimes, and in other ways major things, right? So minor versions, you're sitting in a coffee shop and just the impulse to just trip a stranger as they walk by, not for any reason, not sure. just to be an asshole, right? I feel that impulse, and then that's expanded in other territories into much more serious negative fantasies of destructiveness for no reason, right? Other than destructiveness. So I do think that those impulses reside within us. I think that we have the desire for violence sake, for lust's sake, which is something I think he was struggling with in many ways. And part of the challenge of an orthodox religion, a communal, explicit, external orthodox religion, is the unacceptability of those impulses. It leaves you with a very difficult task of how to reconcile within yourself those desires for rage and violence and lust and greed and domination and evil in some sense. And I rely heavily here on my understanding, however limited it may be, of the work of Carl Jung in the notion of the healing power of reclaiming those sides of yourself, which he called the shadow. And Augustine here had no mechanism by which to do that, and thus felt dragged down by this evil, and needed to come up with some counter opposing force to drag him upward against the force of that evil. Whereas I think one of the notions that Jung would say is that if you are able to accept within yourself that shadow side, it doesn't drag you down in the same way. It is through integration of the shadow that its force for dragging you down is mitigated by it, and not just intellectually, propositionally admitting it to yourself, but deeply integrating that you have these desires, and then you are no longer dragged down by them. So I think that because he did not have those psychotechnologies available, because in many ways he was within an orthodox religious sphere, regardless of which one, he was not able then, he needed some other structure because the actual integrative healing was not available. And I mentioned actually in our previous discussion, Aristotle had this sort of like hierarchy of integration, is that from, and by adding information, right? Form in the Platonic sense, right? So inorganic matter is informed to organic matter. It is, a form is added, and so on and so forth up the hierarchy. And I proposed at that time that perhaps from rational being, which was the top of Aristotle's hierarchy, one could inform to, in a Jungian sense, an individual self. Jung called that individuation, right? That was his notion of the top of the hierarchy. And it just strikes me that that's sort of what Augustine seemed to be wrestling with, is feeling very viscerally these urges towards evil and not knowing what to do with them. And his religious framing gave him no psychotechnology with which to reclaim, own, and thereby overcome by integrating those evil urges. So in this way, as brilliant as his theories are, I also view it a bit as a failure in some sense, because he missed actually the essential, what I would consider the essential step of integrating the shadow, and had to come up with this entire, brilliant, admittedly, but this entire edifice to form a counterpole to the thing that he refused to integrate.
Yeah. So I have some thoughts on that. There's definitely a lot to be said about that. The thing I would remind you, though, is that this was all going down during a time where the Roman Empire was collapsing, right? And it wasn't a pretty situation. And you're living in a time where you're seeing extreme disorder. You're seeing, what are undoubtedly lots of atrocities, right? Because the empire is probably not going with a whimper, right? You have marauding hordes of barbarians that are sacking cities, destroying cities, doing all of the things that back in the ancient world people would do when an opposing force defeats another one. And so you're
and then there's also some bad things happening, but
and this is all going on in his lifetime, right? Because it doesn't just collapse in like 2 years, right?
Sure.
It's collapsing during the entirety of his life. And
Sure.
obviously people are relating stories of, well, this city was sacked and then the barbarians did this and blah, blah, blah. And of course, Rome saw themselves as the civilized world. And so they were seeing, all these uncivilized barbarians, marauding and sacking different cities. And then, the idea of evil was probably forefront in the mind for that reason, right? Much like, perhaps right after World War II, the idea of like, well, how could humans do such, deplorable things, in these concentration camps? That became almost an existential. It almost caused an existential crisis, right? It's like, well, if humans are capable of such a thing, then what measure of divinity can we really lay claim to? And so I think what may have been happening is that his struggle with his sexuality was probably a projection of the larger problem prevalent in the civilization at the time. Is that, okay, this civilization is collapsing and all of this evil is occurring as it collapses. How do you make sense of that at all? Right now, Aristotle, right, was not concerned with these questions, right? And we remarked on previous discussions on these lectures is that, well, Aristotle lived in a time where things were largely stable. There was no domicide going on, right? There was no his city. I mean, he was just sitting under the stoa, writing his philosophies, right? There was no conflict of the world around him for him to wrestle with. He could think about internal processes of the human mind and what is knowledge and what is logic and all of these things, because he had the luxury of the tranquility of the time.
Or at the very least, the conflicts that occurred within the construct of his framework. It was not a conflict
which was not threatened at all.
Yeah,
which
correct.
was not threatened at all. Whereas
there were wars, and things happened, but
nothing as
cataclysmic.
Nothing as cataclysmic as the destruction or what was obviously the demise of a 1,000-year empire, right? Not empire necessarily, but just nation state or
Structure.
system or
Nation,
whatever.
yeah.
Structure, exactly. Which, if you think about it, all of Augustine's ancestors, right, great-great-great-grandfather, probably regarded the whole Roman state as an eternal empire, right? And then when this eternal empire starts to collapse, you are forced to find eternity somewhere else, right? And so then he drags over and he incorporates into his understanding, well, yes, this empire has collapsed, but the empire of God, which lasts forever and which is completely immune, right, to any kind of collapse or decay or entropy, well, that lasts forever, right? And so I think perhaps it's not so much about the sex, right? His sexual deviancy.
No.
It was more, that was probably just a projection of a larger problem, right? The problem of evil was probably prevalent, and then he incorporated that problem into his own sexuality and says, well, evil also resides here, right? And so how do I grapple with the problem of evil? So I think some of that was going on. And it's also interesting to...
I wasn't saying it was overly focused on his sexuality. I think that I agree with you. I think that was one manifestation. But like I said, lust, greed, rage, violence, like all these impulses that we have. Yes, I think there's a much bigger frame of evil that humans wrestle with. But he spotted within himself... Again, the fruit wasn't a sexual issue. I mean, as far as I know, at least. And yet he was very troubled by that pull toward evil, right? So I was making more general statement than just his sexuality. And yes, I agree with you, very much sort of brought to the fore by seeing around him humans giving into that urge in very powerful ways, right? As things collapse, people falling into the restraint of society, of civilization that's imposed by those external constraints goes away as society collapses, right? And then what's constraining those evil impulses, right? And I think I agree with you. The time very much determined his frame there. But nonetheless, I think he was still... There's another answer than just... If there's a pull in one direction, you can either try to mitigate that pull or you can pull in the other direction. And because he had no psychotechnology to mitigate that pull, he was framed primarily on pulling in the other direction. The other thing I would say that I was very struck by, and this goes back to some of our previous discussions, even when we were talking about Buddhism, right, is he has this moment of enlightenment, of oneness, this mystic transfer, right? And yet, unlike the Buddha, unlike many traditions that will tell you, oh, you need to seek this, it wasn't enough, right? He had the mystic oneness. He was enlightened, and yet it wasn't enough. And that is something I think that is deeply important and that we've kind of circled around in other discussions, that no, there is no end point. Just merely achieving, you meditate and you do all this stuff and then you reach enlightenment and then you're done, right? And it doesn't work that way. And I think his confessions are a profound sort of rebuking of that view that merely achieving the moment, the experience of enlightenment, no matter how nice it is, does not inherently save you from these other troubles.
Yeah, I think that was an argument you made during the commentary we did on the Buddha, which is that enlightenment is not a final destination, right? That you get there and like, well, I'm done now, like the project is over, I have arrived, right? There's a guru, whatever, like of an Indian background who's very popular on Twitter, who shall remain, not Twitter, I mean YouTube, who shall remain nameless. That, I once, against my better judgment, I was watching some lecture of his or some talk of his. And, he very casually, in this very professorial way was, when I reached my enlightenment and, and then he goes on to say some other statement, right? You just got to throw it out there as like, when he arrived and achieved this thing, right?
Sure.
As if like his life was divided into the before and after, right? Like afterwards, everything that he says is now the sage advice of an enlightened person, right? And that the project of, wisdom, generation, and personal growth and character development is now at a standstill because it has reached its final state. It's kind of the implication of that, right? And I very much agree with you. There was another YouTube video I was watching of an actual Buddhist monk who, a very hardcore meditator, that's all he did. And he was being interviewed. He didn't have a YouTube channel. He was being interviewed about his practice. And he was a Westerner that went over to the East and started doing these practices with great gusto. And the reason, he says, well, the purpose of life is to be enlightened, right? That was his conclusion. And that was like what he was aiming at, right? And it's good to have that experience, but like you said, it doesn't necessarily give you some sort of permanent moral claim or immunity from a lack of wisdom. It moves the bar quite a bit, I'm sure, and you probably get a lot out of the experience and all of the things, but it doesn't make you immune from foolishness later, on down the road. I mean, this guru I mentioned from India, like he's like driving motorcycles, he's on Instagram, like it's this whole thing, right? It's pretty awful to like watch, right? Because he still wears the garb, right? But then he's on a motorcycle, and then he's like, he's on
what
a beach
got
with
against
women.
Motorcycles? What's
well,
women.
I mean, his whole thing was like, look how exciting and flashy my life is, right? Like I can be enlightened and yet also partake in the materialism of the world. These things are compatible. Is the subliminal message that he's trying to send, right? It's this, it's a new version of like you could have your spirituality and cake as well at the same time, right? It's sort of that. It's this sort of you can still
Which
be.
I kind
you
of
can still
agree
be
with.
part
To
of
be
the,
honest, I don't think those things are separate. I mean, I don't think that. And again, actually, this gets very deeply into the notion of Augustine in some sense, right? I think one of the reasons his sexuality troubled him so much is because he viewed it as fundamentally oppositional to goodness and spiritual achievement. And in that framing, he was unable to reconcile that. And he did not reach the step, I think, of saying, well, maybe that framing of opposition is the problem.
Yeah.
And so similarly here, I think we typically, out of maybe Aquinas, frame material desires as fundamentally opposed to spirituality. And then we end up in a bind. And the framing issue is maybe these things aren't actually hostile to each other.
And I don't disagree with that either. I think in this particular guy's case,
I agree.
The spirituality was fake. It was just a ruse. He was like, listen, I have wisdom to impart, and
right.
That's why you should listen to me because I was enlightened.
Right, and that's an important distinction where somebody can actually get some aspect right. Where I think, hey, look, it's great to point out that spirituality and materialism are somewhat not maybe in opposition to each other in the way that Aquinas would promote, right, and has promoted through the Romanticism and all these other periods. However, that does not necessarily justify the predatory behavior of like Joel Osteen and other like these church mega pastor, or mega church pastors, or and this is a version of that, right? It's a spiritual bypass of claiming some sort of like connection to higher power that then allows me access to all these material goods and undercuts the meaningful moral transformation that I'm claiming, right? So yes, so I think, and I will say, I think that's the impulse that is there in saying, hey, these things should be separate. I think the reason that we feel that is it's proof. Is it saying, hey, if I'm adhering to the spirituality at the cost of my material pleasure or satisfaction or my sexual satisfaction or whatever the deal is, then you know that I'm legit in some sense, right? Mm-hmm. Like then I'm proving to you that I'm not doing it for some other gain, right? Which is the danger of believing in a guru. But also it creates a falsehood there because like, I don't want to give up my espresso machine just to achieve spiritual growth, nor do I have to. So that's also a falsehood, right? And so, I don't know. I think maybe the conflation there is rife for abuse from the predatory, but also then in order to avoid the abuse, you end up creating false demand on people who are trying to grow.
Yeah, unnecessary asceticism. right?
Yeah,
Like
correct.
you don't have to be an ascetic and give up all your worldly possession, to live a good and spiritual life. This kind of comes back to the Stoics, right, who wanted to engage with the world, right?
Yes. Yeah, great,
St. Augustine,
great point.
went on to, join a monastery and, became kind of an ascetic as well, after the fact. And, he lived a very sort of ascetic life. He ended up overcoming, these, supposedly, overcoming these sexual proclivities, and it seems like he finally moved past what was tormenting him, and he ended up living a pretty pious life for the next 40 years and everything. But that was also a form of disengagement from a family life, right? I mean, he did at least have one son when he was sexually promiscuous, but when he became a born again Christian, so to speak, that door completely shut down, right? He was not, a family man anymore, right? His family was his church, right? And yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I admire about Stoicism is like, no, go out and engage with the world as you find it, right? And do not like shy away. The world is what it is. You're not going to go back and live in the cave or whatever. Just, stick to
and I think there's something
trying to operate in the world.
I think there's something really important there, because what's the ultimate version of going into a cave? It's suicide. Like, the ultimate withdrawal is to disengage completely from life, right? So it's an impulse to say, well, it's easier for me to not be sexually promiscuous if I hide away in a monastery. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's also easier if you just kill yourself, right? Like, then yes. So I think it's interesting that Christianity had to create this very strong prohibition against suicide, because in many ways it's promoting this withdrawal from the world, or this Aquinian sort of like the world is corrupt kind of thing. Whereas the Stoics are saying, no, you might be corrupt, but you're not going to overcome that by merely decreasing temptation, right? You in fact, I would argue in a very powerful way, if you truly just reduce temptation, you just become weaker. It's like saying, oh, I can't lift 100 pounds in the gym, so I'm just not going at all. Well, no, the answer is not to not go at all. It's to go lift 50 pounds and then 55 and then 60 and gradually increase. And so I think that misses the point in terms of spiritual growth, spiritual strength. And I think the Stoics kind of had that more dialed in to say, yes, there's training involved. It's not, you don't just go like, oh, I'm a sex addict, I'm going to go to a brothel and be fine. That's not going to go well, right? But going to a cave is also not the answer.
Changing tracks over here, there's a lot to think about and meditate over this whole idea of reading, and how initially reading and reciting really was a deeply Gnostic practice, right? And I haven't had any experience in this at all, but when he was explicating the idea, I'm like, man, that does make a lot of sense, right? And I think it was Vervaeke himself. He was on some podcast where he was describing, he didn't describe it as a Gnostic exercise, but he says, well, there was a practice that we did where a bunch of us were in a room together, and we took a line or two from Spinoza, right? And then we would all, say the line out loud, and then we would talk about what the line, this sentence meant to us. And then we would sort of just, go around the room, and, the next person would have to build on what I said. And then and he says we sort of just did this, in a cooperative sort of way inside the room. And he says it then felt as if Spinoza was in the room with us after all. The eidos of that idea of Spinoza was, had been given life to, right? And that obviously is a very participatory way of reading Spinoza, right? It is not a propositional way of knowing. And I'd have to say I've never done anything like that in my life. And, obviously, because this is a psychotechnology that's really not, I can understand, however, so around this time, there was also a lot of suspicion, against the Gnostics, right? Because when you're doing these things, it sounds like, what is this, magic? What are you guys doing over there, right? Where they may be chanting, they may be putting themselves in altered states, to be doing it in a community setting. For all the world, it sounds like a secret ritual, right? Which immediately becomes conspiratorial. And of course, Gnostic mythologies had conspiratorial elements, driven within them as well.
Sure.
And so it further sort of solidified this notion that this was all sort of a conspiratorial act. But I have to say, I am drawn to the idea of this sort of a participatory reading of any text, right?
Yeah.
He did a really good job in the lecture of driving home. I summarized it. I compressed it a lot in my summary, but he did an excellent job of talking about how recitation of words, right, as opposed to just reading the words, was very much a conformatory kind of knowing. It was a participatory knowing. It was an embodied kind of knowing that could change your perspective on things. It could change you. The words go through you, right, and it's an experiential exercise, right, and it's very fascinating, and I'm just compelled to find some poetry and start reciting it in my room. But again, one of the
that I do that. Actually, you and I have talked at other times about. I will I recite lines from Macbeth that I find very moving. I'm constantly in many of our discussions. I'll quote Gibran, or I'll quote E. Cummings, or any of the poetic authors that I have been struck by, passages even from books that I find uniquely compelling. Part of that, and it's just striking to me, I feel very fortunate, I'll have to thank my parents, is they gave me that experience. I remember as a child, we would sit around, and it was a kid's book that was age appropriate, but rather than watching TV, we would take turns reading aloud a chapter from the book together in the room. And part of that was reading the book and just not watching TV, which my dad kind of disapproved of, broadly speaking. And part of that was inherently teaching the skill of reading aloud with emotion, with what is the story saying, which parts are dramatic, which it's not a flat reading. It's an embodied, acted reading, right? My dad loved poetry and taught us to savor the texture of words in our mouth as we spoke. That was a different experience than reading mathematics texts,
sure,
right? And then in high school, one of the most profound classes I took was acting. I took acting for the last 2 years of high school as a class. And once again, that framing of, well, how does the way you step change the character of the person you're playing? And the facial gestures, and I'm not an actor, I'm not but there's an art to it. There's a skill to it, right? It's not merely a triviality, right? And engaging even for a brief time with that allowed me to pursue medicine. I don't think I could have pursued medicine without those 2 years of acting, because very much in medicine, you put on the persona of a doctor, right? I'm not really myself. My problems are irrelevant in this sphere. I'm serving in a different way, in a different capacity. So through all those reasons, I found that the notion of recitation has come to me very naturally, very much in contrast to your experience, because I've had a ton of practice. And I have done this quite a lot, even through childhood. And I'm very grateful to my parents for kind of giving me that rounded experience in a different way, because now even when and I read very differently too, right? So I don't, by contrast, I have a friend who, when she reads aloud to herself in her head. That's her experience of reading. So she's even on the far end of that spectrum, right? Whereas when I'm reading propositionally, when I'm reading text for information, I'm not reading aloud in my head. It's a completely different way of reading. It's text straight into conception, right? Into mental model, right? And that's very different than reading poetry, where even when I'm reading it quietly, I'm reading it aloud in my head, because it's the texture, the experience, the beingness of that poem. And I remember having a conversation with a good friend about, he's like, I don't really get poetry. Like, why is that interesting, right? And I had a hard time explaining it. Vervaeke, of course, has found much better wording than I could at that time. But one of the things we kind of came on is it's much closer to your experience of song. That is modern. In modern times, that's the only thing that is a remnant there, is songs as poetry. When you sing, And there have been some, Leonard Cohen comes to mind, right? Damian Rice, Bob Dylan, like some of these people were really deep spiritual expressions of a time and place and feeling, and deep human truths as well. But that's the last remnant we have of this reciting version, this communal, and we sing in groups typically, right? Yeah, we sing in the shower as well, but it's also a communal, it's also a group activity, it's a religious activity for many people, and that grows out of a tradition, parts of which we've lost.
Yeah, like, singing in church,
Exactly.
Yeah. It's very much, not just about God, but it's also, there's especially black churches, right? They're very powerful singing sort of cultures and even dancing, right? In black churches. It also probably explains why Shakespeare didn't write novels. He wrote plays, right? That had to be enacted, right? That it had to be actually...
Actually, you can take that a step further. Why does anyone write a novel instead of a philosophical treatise? Right? Why do novels exist at all in some sense? Right?
It's an attempt to embody it as a story,
yes.
right? That it's still a vestige, really, right, of the recitation aspect, right? Because you're not even reciting it, but at least you're putting some flesh on it.
Sure. And then poetry is an extension further back into that recitatory, what's the word there? That reciting frame in which really good poetry often is flat if it's unrecited. If it is merely read, you are missing some significant part of what's going on there.
Yeah, because you should be trying to embody, try to let the word seep into you.
And act out. I think that's the part you have to overcome that feeling of silliness that might occur at first. And that's what acting was so valuable about is, yes, if you say, okay, hey, I'm going to play Macbeth on stage, since we're talking about Shakespeare here, but it may feel silly at first until you become Macbeth. And then it's just real in some sense, right? That ability to embody that other frame, it's shamanistic, going all the way back in these lectures, right? Is let me see what it would be like to be an animal. Let me see what it would be like to be Macbeth. And by the way, like one of the most profoundly difficult. So in a school play, it was a series of skits, right? And in one of them, I had to play a dog. Now, emotionally, that's a very difficult thing for a young man to try. Like who because it feels silly, it feels humiliating, it feels whatever, right? And it's played for laughs, but that was a difficult experience to embrace at least for a moment, to embrace that frame, right? That is so counter to so much of my personality, very intellectual, very, aggressive, very direct, right? But then that's also a different way of being. It has that sort of, again, that shamanistic idea of embodied being. And these poems, these plays give you a frame. They give you something to step into rather than shamanism in that sense is wide open, right? You're basically just tripping on sleep deprivation and psychedelics and then see where it takes you, right? Yeah. But this at least gives you a frame.
There's another tangent I want us to take us to. One final thing I'll say about recitation and the Gnostic way of reading, I suppose, is, I wish that there was some kind of a sapiential community in modern times that I could tap into, that was spiritually aligned, right? I mean, a group of strangers coming together just reading whatever poetry they like, that's all well and good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't know that would feed or inform or result in progress towards, my spiritual pursuits as such, right? And, while you have philosophy groups and you have YouTube channels that'll talk about philosophy all day long, since this is an experiential thing, it requires the presence of other people, right? So there's one thing to do it by yourself, but it's a whole other thing to have a community do it with you, right? Because the presence of other people, I think, compounds and allows for the transformational effect that occurs with gnosis, right? Because you are being witnessed in some respect by other people in your altered sort of persona or state, and that perhaps helps to internalize it a little bit better. But perhaps, right? But there's another tangent I want us to go down, right? Which is that the problem that Aquinas faced was that, Aristotle during the Dark Ages was not read as widely because people were busy trying to, not die for 1,000 years. And reading Aristotle was not a priority. But then when he is rediscovered in the 12th, 13th centuries, during the Crusades, they had to then reconcile Aristotle's idea with what at that point had become a very rigid sort of power hierarchy with the church, right? Where the church was the sole authority and it had all the information, all the knowledge you needed. What do you need knowledge from any other source other than the Bible, right? It's all heresy. And that the only way that could be reconciled is that if you just split the two apart, right? The whole axial age, two worlds mythology had to be split and had to be bifurcated a little bit and says, well, God lives there and reason lives down here. Now, my thinking is, the reason that Christianity lasted and was so important for such a long time was because of the collapse of the Roman Empire, right? The eternity had to start residing elsewhere, right? Because up to that point, people could, who lived in Roman times at least, could point to the eternal empire that they lived in and says, well, this is our eternal empire. And I think the Egyptians probably had a very similar structure as well. I mean, the axial age revolution probably occurred with the collapse of the Egyptian empire, right? Where you had to reformulate like what eternity meant, right? And this is happening again now with the collapse of the Roman Empire. And in this particular instance, Christianity went and Christianity was the eternal empire. But if the Roman Empire had never collapsed, then this reconciliation would not have to happen, right? And then you wouldn't have to divorce reason and love from each other anymore. And I kind of, almost feel like while Christianity did a lot of useful things in the so-called Dark Ages, right? It was, that way of thinking was also an albatross around the neck of the reason project, or the Neoplatonic project of ascent using reason up the normative order, and it was almost a bastardized reconciliation. Aquinas had to cobble some theory together to reconcile one with the other, but it was an imperfect solution, right? I mean, we're faced with the consequences of this, imperfect solution 8 centuries later, with profound meaning crisis, because we are now in the midst of an even greater sense of propositional tyranny. I wonder if you think that there is room to recover the Neoplatonic project, or the Aristotelian, the Platonic project, I should say, of fusing together again love, or agape, and reason. Where spirituality and reason are again, tightly commingled to each other. And to be a person who embraces rationality and reason is to be a spiritual person, right? We talked about this recently in our commentary on Lecture 7, right? Where understanding your world was a spiritual act, right? Because it allowed you to exercise reason, right? And if you understood your world better, you conform to a better version of reality, then you were more integrated as a person, right? This is a perspective we've completely lost, right? Then, you could lay some of the blame at the feet of Christianity, right? Which is, it was probably very necessary because humanity needed an eternal empire, right? And Christianity filled that void. But it came at a cost, right? And now we have to sort of dig ourselves out of that rubble.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'll say, just more as an aside, is we say Christianity in this circumstance because it was the one that was handy, right? I think very much the Muslim world is currently in the exact same state.
Exactly,
right?
Correct. Yeah.
It doesn't have a central church the way Catholicism did, but nonetheless, that same impulse is being filled by that same. So I think Christianity happened to be there as the thing, but it's not inherent to Christianity itself as a doctrine. However, I think that is the fundamental challenge. I do think that, and I'm just going to add a little bit on, having some of my memories of taking philosophy or history of philosophy and some of the stuff we read from the medieval period in college, just strikes me how different the concept of reason was then. Like, I forget the name of the philosopher, but Bartholomew, Bartolius, something, an unusual name, but anyway, but my philosophy teacher kind of like explained his worldview as he's like, well, I'll start reasoning from here and I'll start reasoning from here, and if they don't match up, that's just the way the world is. Like there was not the same impulse. Like he just would write text and reason from two ends and then reach an obvious sort of disconnect and end there. That was just, he was like, yeah, that they didn't connect, like shrug, moving, like, and that would be so unacceptable today. And Aquinas very much kind of started that process of like, wait a minute, no, you can't just, no, right? There has to be logical consistency, and that's extended through Descartes, right? That need for like, no, reason works a particular way. We're formalizing logical thinking in certain ways, and that itself, that formalization is a psychotechnology in some sense, right? And it's not that nobody reasoned before, but it didn't have the same demand for rigor, or at least not quite in the same way. And that also created some of these pressures, right? Is that once you have to come up with precise definitions, then it very much shows you where things are not lining up. Whereas maybe older thinkers thought that these things were lining up because they allowed definitions to be a little looser than the scientific worldview would allow anymore, right?
Right.
And so, I mean, like he pointed out, there were thinkers in ancient Greece that had pointed out that the world was round and that the world, was not likely not at the center. Like this was not new with Galileo and Copernicus. There were ancient Greek thinkers that had these ideas, but somehow that disconnect was not as problematic for Aristotle. He was content with his geocentric worldview because it explains psychologically and meaningfully what was happening and how to operate in the world, and that was his bigger project, right? The fact that there was discordant data was triviality and irrelevancy on some level, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could go as far as to say that the idea of data, right, or experimentation or empiricism didn't exist at that time, right? So it was not a problem that needed to be reconciled at all.
No. I mean, they did. I mean, there were experiments, right? I mean, like very famously, one of the ways that they knew that the world was round at that time was by taking measurements in cities several distances apart with a stick of a certain height at the same time of day, and the shadows could only be different if the world were curved, right? And so, like, they very clearly were generating empirical data, but it just didn't have the same importance. Like, logical or consistency with data didn't have that same level of importance. That's a product of the sort of scientific revolution where science takes primacy, right? Rather than sort of the project of how to live a good life being prime. And then science as it fits in, right? Like to the degree that it fits in, we'll allow it. To the degree that it doesn't, it can go fuck itself, right? And that was a big
I should
shift.
say the empirical experimentation, there was not that much of it, right? So it's not like
the volume
when
of data
Galileo
was less.
when Galileo formalized,
Sure.
like, okay, this is how we should do science. It should be repeatable experiments that are reproducible. This is a process, right? That formalization
the process
of
was-
science that didn't exist during Aristotle's time. It was some person did some interesting thing with sticks, like hey ho, like it was not threatening. The way I understand rationality as Aristotle, thought about it, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, is it was more of a process of examining self-deception. is like,
Yes.
where are we thinking wrong about ourselves?
It's so funny,
in the
yeah.
bullshit, sort of sense of the word, right? Like, how are we deluding ourselves, right? And that is what it meant to be rational. Is that, that's why Socrates would go around like, well, what is valor? What is courage? What does it mean to be this?
Right.
Blah blah blah. And then they would answer what they thought were quote unquote obvious things, and then he would point out like, well, that doesn't
The
make any
flaws.
sense at all, right?
Yeah, correct.
So you are not being quote unquote rational, right? Because these propositions don't really add up. These assumptions you're making, they easily just sort of break apart, with minimal examination, right? Then you end up being in delusion. And then Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. But it's the examination of your own way of thinking that was what it meant to be rational, right? And that's what I'm getting at when I say that, is there a way to then recover the importance, right, of one, needing to be rational about ourselves? One of the mantras that I've sort of tossed around in my head quite a bit is asking myself, in what ways am I deluding myself, or what ways am I bullshitting myself, or telling lies to myself, or have things wrong because I myself am allowing it to happen, right? I am being irrational because I'm making assumptions that I'm not critically examining, and then I go with them, and then that results in errors, and that is really the heart of wisdom. And I think that's what the Greeks were talking about when they talked about rationality, and the love of wisdom was just the inner examination of our own belief systems, and not letting them lead us astray. And then the scientific revolution happened, and then rationality turned into math, right, which is a completely disembodied, sense of rationality. Right, it had nothing to do with my assumptions, my beliefs about myself. Science would figure that out for you. You don't have to do the work at all, right?
I mean, it's fascinating, right? I mean, it's so interesting you went here with it, because literally it's the same place I was going to go, and now we can kind of really go back and forth a little bit on this, I think, because okay, just reframing the axial two worlds idea, right? Let's start there. Is in that idea is here in this world, it's not the world of the unreal. It's the world of bullshitting ourselves, and the world of the forms on some level was a world without bullshit, right? It was a world that was the project, right? It
doesn't have the same ring to it, but I get your point.
Yeah. And that was the project, right? Is how can I avoid self-deception? In what ways am I out of touch with that higher reality here in this world because I have allowed myself to be deluded, or to have my relevance realization hijacked, or to, been pulled in a direction that is not in keeping with those truths. So that was the original sort of two worlds idea, right? And the method was reason. And I should clarify my earlier comment is that, like, obviously the Greeks did have some maybe not quite formalized in the same way, but some semi-formal methods of reasoning, and that was part of what was being rediscovered there. Is that was kind of lost in the collapse, and part of what was being discovered with Aristotle and Socrates and whatever was those methods of reasoning, and then it was reapplied differently, now being applied to data and abstracted further. So the method that was used, reason, logic, was abstracted, perfected, and improved, and then applied to data, but lost the entire point of the original project, which was to avoid self-deception, right? Now, it grew out of that desire to avoid self. What is really going on? Is the sun really going around the earth or not, right? So it's a similar impulse. You can see how one grew out of the other, but then you can also see how that original point was progressively lost into further and further abstraction. And Augustine here is reminding us, to what end? Like, what is the thing that drives reason? You're reasoning about all this, you're learning all these things, for what? Right? It's that love of oneness, that love of connectedness, both external and internal, right? And without that love, there isn't the whole purpose of the project falls apart, right? Like,
Yeah.
why do we care about science? Like, what difference does it make whether you know what's happening, right? I wrote down a couple of quotes actually that I don't know if you remember, very old movie, John Travolta, Phenomenon.
Yeah, I do remember. Yeah. I don't remember a
And one of the
quote from
quotes
it, though. Yeah.
one of the quotes I've always loved from it was he said, "Look, you've got this desperate grasp on technology and this grasp on science, and you don't have a hand left to grab what's really important." Right? And that was that struck me. And that whole movie in many ways is this guy, his brain hyper functioning, et cetera, et cetera. And he does undergo a huge intellectual cognitive elevation, but oddly enough, ends up with a spiritual transformation.
Yeah.
Right? And the point, the artistic point of that movie, the experience of that movie, dare I say, is the notion that mere cognition, if you're smart enough, you would realize that mere cognition is not the point. You have missed the point if you only engage in mere cognition, right? And from a character who supposedly is the final potential of human intelligence, is realizing and telling you the point is not gathering scientific data. The point is something bigger, something more spiritual than that, right?
Yeah.
And without that, the whole project falls apart, because then you just have mounds of data abstracted into organized structures for no purpose whatsoever.
Yeah. So, to reframe a little bit of one snippet of what you said, though, is, the Neoplatonic goal was to use reason to ascend up the levels, higher and higher levels of reality, to get union and integration with the one. And the engine that was used to get you up there was reason, right? Contemplation, meditation, use reason to divorce yourself of self-deception and integrate more and more. And then St. Augustine says you can cut through that. You could do that by just agape, right? If you just live your life agapically, then as to quote Vervaeke, you transcend reason to get to what reason always sought. Right, which is a very clever way of putting that, right? Which is that for St. Augustine, you could have that transformation, that union with the one, the ascent and anagoge with the psychotechnology of agape, right? So you could get there with reason, of course. And he was, a trained rhetorician, right? He was a professor of rhetoric, St. Augustine. So he knew his logic, he knew his stuff, right? But he says, another way of doing that, another way of getting to that anagogic pinnacle union with the one, is the technology of agape, which is, at the end of the day, what are we trying to get to, right? You could do it through reason, you could get through agape, and he said agape is that, that technology that can get us there also, right? You can get there with reason, but you could also get there with agape, and that was sort of the way that he had that insight, right? And then also, of course,
it's an
had
interesting
that overarching historical narrative of Christianity and the eternal kingdom. I think that was also an important contribution of his.
I don't disagree. I think it is a very interesting notion there that, you compare and contrast to some degree, like Augustine and Jesus himself, right? Like, and the notion there that I don't know, what does agape look like, right? Is agape, okay, great. You come to this conclusion, agape is where it's at, X, Y, and Z, and then you retreat to a monastery to live an ascetic life, and you're like, I don't know, right? Like that's not what Jesus did, right? Like that's not how that psychotechnology manifested, and so it rings a little bit hollow for me with Augustine in that framing, just because, again, he missed that Stoic sort of actually the Jesus kind of thing of like, hey, like, this is okay, cool, agape, great, go out and do it in the real world, right?
No, that's a good point. And me and you I was actually reflecting on this yesterday when I was going through this lecture, is me and you have had slight differences about exactly what agape should entail, right? There's the two flavors of it, right? Infinite compassion, no matter what you do, turn the other cheek. And there's a harsher, I mean, I hesitate to use that term, but there's a more strict version of it where you exhort your fellow man or woman to be better versions of themselves, right? And that exhortation could actually take on a stern tone sometimes. They could, be, going up to a friend and saying, listen, you are bullshitting yourself. You are doing things that are not correct. You need to get your shit in order. Right. So,
sure.
Some of Jordan Peterson's, exhortations, right, as stern as they sound, right, are versions of this sort of agapic kind of impulse, right, of I want to lift you all up. And in order to do that, I have to give you some harsh truths and I have to tell you you're being an asshole or something. Right. And that's also agape. Right. And then there's this issue of discernment about, okay, when do you use, maximum compassion and you just say, that's okay. I love you anyway. Everything is going to be okay. And when do you say, all right, you fucked up, you need to get your house in order, make your bed, all the things, right?
And things will be okay as soon as you stop fucking up.
Or they'll be better. And both things are agapic, right?
Sure.
The commonality between the two things, right, is to have an unreserved concern for the well-being of others, right? And then how you proceduralize enhancing the well-being of others is something that, is discernment, right? Sometimes you do need to be stern and sometimes you need to just be kind, right? And when do you show one face and when do you show the other? There's no answer to that, right? That's just in the moment with every situation, with with all these different moving parts. But the underlying notion is that you have this strong concern for others, and that is what is motivating you, right?
And for the truth, right? And for the notion of what is really going on with this person, meaning what is the context of this person's experience? What did they mean by that really? So rather than just jumping to a conclusion, because you said that in that way, that means that you're well, hang on. Investigate first. If you're coming from
rational.
an agapic, be rational first, right? And in order to express agape in the real world, you have to make sure you're dealing with the real world. It's interesting. I had a conversation with a friend recently, and she was kind of annoyed with me, kind of saying you know what I mean. Why are you asking? And I was like, well, actually, I feel like I tried to interpret the combination of your body language, the context, the moment, your words, your tone. And the problem is my brain realized that could come from two different places. There were still two explanations that would explain all of this information. So I don't know what you mean, actually. Right? Now, I could assume I knew what you meant and just go with it. And in some ways, that might have made the conversation smoother, or it could have led to conflict down the line, right? Because I allowed the bullshit to just sit there. Right? And so, yes, it does get a bit annoying sometimes. I get that for common conversation for me to be like, well, what, very Socratic, right? There's no reason they killed him. Is, right. It's annoying for somebody to be like, well, what do you mean by that, right? So this burger you say you want, what do you mean by burger, right? And of course, that's frustrating. So I was sympathetic to the irritation, but also unclear as to what to do about it because I truly don't know what you mean, actually. I could pretend and I could go along with it, but I would be very aware that no, we may be using, it seems like we're defining those words differently. And now I don't know if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, and I don't know, and there's a combination of the desire for social ease and the desire for clarity and not allowing either one of us to kind of sit in bullshit or pretend like we're communicating when we're not, right? I'm thinking you're saying one thing, you're thinking you're...
Is this about the story about me?
It's actually not, which shows you that it is a more pervasive problem. It could have been a story about you, actually, just as easily.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's one of the challenges.
I think I love talking about this particular subject, agape, because my own notions of this have been refined, largely through our conversations. Our own. I kind of feel like we should do another podcast on agape, on the agape lecture all over again.
Yeah, 3 hours wasn't enough.
Yeah, that 3 hours is not enough. But it's exactly this, right? Is that in that moment when your friend said a thing and you're like, well, I'm not actually sure what you mean, then it takes a lot of discernment, self-knowledge, knowledge of the situation, all of which are rational activities that are afforded to you, or rather insights that are afforded to you through the faculty of rationality, right? It takes, conformity to the situation in its totality to then try to discern what is the best next move that is also agapic, right? Because the next best move could be to nod along like, yeah, I totally know what you mean. Not because, like in the moment you want to be strict about definitions, but because the person is just going through a really rough time. All that's really important to them is they just need to vomit out some frustration, and your role is just to like be the recipient of that, hearing the frustration. And then when you say, hold on a second, let's get strict about definitions, all you are doing is making them more frustrated, right? And all of that is, that requires skill, that requires, a rational insight into yourself, a rational understanding of the situation, and then knowing what the right maneuver is in that moment, right? Is it to stop and to like press the definitions, or is it to be compassionate and say, oh yeah, I totally know what you mean, that's terrible, right? I mean, it sounds like you're really having a hard day, right? And that, then revisit the definitions at another more opportune moment when they're more emotionally available to be able to have that conversation, right? And that is where, that's deep agape, right? To be able to be able to have that discernment, because
definitely
blanket,
an area where I struggle. I mean, in some sense,
it's everybody. It's not you.
Yeah.
It's this is very difficult. I mean, because you yourself may be emotionally exhausted. You made a long day in the hospital. You got two brain cells left that are rubbing against each other. You have no time, no mental faculties left to like meditate on someone else's problem, and then you can make a snap judgment that is incorrect, and you have failed in your own agapic endeavors. But that's because you're a human, right? And that's not a mark of bad character, but then the key always when you err is to then return, and I even have agapic for your own self. I'm like, yes, I messed that whole agapic endeavor up with this person, but let me also have agape for myself and say, listen, I was tired, I did not maneuver myself well in that situation. But the key here, the thing I want to emphasize is that even in a situation when someone is say angry at you, right, is sometimes the agapic response is to be angry back, right? But sometimes the agapic response is to just, let them yell and scream at you, right? I mean, you have some married couples, right, where, the wife just gets into a big tizzy and then yells and screams, and then the husband, yes, dear, and, not that he agrees with anything she has to say, but just understands, because he knows her, that she just needs to get this out, right? And then like 10 minutes later, she'll have cooled down and she'll be fine again, right? And so that is the agapic response in that situation, right? And it's complicated. It's not easy.
Very complicated.
That's why these sort of overgeneralizations that go, well, should you turn the other cheek all the time, or should you just like punch back, an aggressor? Yeah. It's never clear.
Never one
right?
thing. Yeah. I mean, exactly. It's in that example you gave, the husband and wife, like, yeah, maybe that is the agapic response in that circumstance, at that moment, at that time. Yeah. To what degree is at some point the agapic response to be like, hey, hon, like this is not a healthy way of dealing with life.
Right.
Like you got to, or promoting connection between us and enhancing this marriage. It's not working. It's not a good idea. Right. And so now she's not going to like that, and it's going to lead to, then you have to fight the fight. Right. But there's a time and a place, and you got to find the right rhythm and find the right move. And I think it's difficult too. I think something, again, I was reflecting on this after this friend kind of pointed it out. And oddly enough, this work that we're doing here, investigating Vervaeke, studying these things, almost makes it worse because it's all loaded up, right? It's all very front and center in my mind of the importance of not bullshitting, the importance of whatever. And sometimes that becomes an overemphasized aspect where, like you said, the person's just venting, and I'm like, oh, you're using that word imprecisely. And like my brain just, feeds it to me because I'm in this world right now. I'm deeply and have been, I mean, my whole life really. And then especially where I get tripped up is when someone's venting, and as a sort of like natural, people do this. It's a natural mode of expression. It's not a thing. But they say, what am I going to do about that? Or what should I do about this like situation, whatever. And they'll pause looking for a response, right? And probably the correct response is not to answer the question, but to say, man, it seems really hard. Like it's a really hard situation, right? Whatever. Yes. Instead, I get very literal, and I'm what you should do is stop bullshitting yourself about this. Yeah. You ask me a question, and I'm answering the question.
Yeah, or you break out the spreadsheets and the math, like, well, let's compute this out, right? Like,
or that's not what they were asking. Or the Vervaeke wisdom of like, hey, this is where you're bullshitting yourself. Like, these are the lies you're telling yourself in this whole thing that you vented out. I'm showing you the thread of nonsense that's causing you pain. Now, in some ways, it ends up solving the problem, right? It also, wants the person to slip some hemlock into your drink, right? Like, and it's a frustrating kind of, and again, those are my failures in these areas where I tend to be a bit literal. If you ask me a question, I'm going to try and answer it. And so, learning even that is unwise. It's outside the realm of what they're really trying to do, and like you said, but then also being forgiving to myself that okay, this is a bit of my nature, it's a bit whatever, and when I'm tired especially, like I tend to make these errors, and out of the best, like I want to help, right? I like, hey, you're struggling, you're having a hard time, I see the thread of bullshit. What am I going to not tell you? Like that feels hard. But maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should not tell you. Maybe I may tell you later, right? Having faith that there will be a later to discuss this and it'll be fine.
Exactly. And again, we've heard this so many times. Discernment is the heart of wisdom, right? And I don't think that you could proceduralize it is the problem, right? You just have to know, right? That there's some discernment involved, but it cannot be reduced to some algorithm like, well, in this situation, always do this, right? That's where does
Japanese
that discernment even
orders,
come?
Right?
Where does that discernment even come from? There's something mysterious about that, right? Is that you hear about someone saying, well, he has good judgment, right? There's like of all of the different possibilities, right? And, we tend to sort of collapse that to like, well, that's because of experience. He's seen, like a physician would sometimes do, right? He's seen 10,000 cases. That's why he has good judgment, right? But in these sort of complex social situations, sometimes judgment is involved in deciding, okay, should I present a sympathetic face or a helpful face or an angry face? And all of these things are decisions. I think, the entire notion of agape is that whatever the decision is must be rooted in a genuine desire to be helpful. Right. Yes. Now you could miscalculate, right? Correct. You could be compassionate when you're not supposed to be. You could be angry when you're supposed to be compassionate. All the things, but as long as the impulse is always rooted there, right? If that is your ground source, that's your initial starting position, you will end up making less errors in a lifetime of decisions, right? And perhaps that is the message that Jesus wanted to like convey is you should always have that orientation.
And even your error, I think that's a big part of it. I think it's also that even your errors become more acceptable. If someone genuinely knows that you made this error, and I think it was an error, but it came from a good place. I think people can tell that, and I think it does matter to them that you weren't being an asshole out of being an asshole. You were being angry because from a true desire for my own best interest. And it's a lot easier to take. Like, if you get upset with me because you think I'm fucking up my life, well, even if I disagree that was the right time to get upset or to express that, it's a lot easier to take because I genuinely believe it's not out of self-interest, right? It's out of interest in my well-being, right? And I think that's communicated. I think that's part of the psychotechnology there, that gets communicated. I mentioned the Japanese chick sorters. It's my favorite example of this, right?
I don't know this.
Oh, dude, it's one of my favorite things, right? And is that the chicks have so certain type of chick has to be sorted male and female, right? And other than under a microscope, like even scientists don't have a way of distinguishing male and female. Like internally, there is obviously a difference, but like on the external surface, there's no visual cue. Right? But the difference between them, like even for scientists, let alone for lay people, right? And when they get a new chick sorter, he starts out just by randomly putting one in this is male, this is female, and the expert behind him says yes or no. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, right? And over time, they develop 100% accuracy through that feedback method. But they themselves cannot tell you why. Like, why? How did you know this was female or this was male? The person, even at 100% accuracy, cannot tell you, cannot articulate how he knows. He just knows, right? And so this ability to pick up on cues that are so subtle. Another example is the game Go, right? Like, there are ways that AI plays Go, but there are ways that humans play Go because it's a 19 by 19 board. Every possible move has such an exponential set of possible places. There's no way for conscious calculation to get you there, right? It is insight honed by experience and judgment and an artistic sense. And there's all these weird things that come into play to compensate for the fact that there's no possible way to calculate the exponential set of possibilities, right? And yet the masters in the world are able to win consistently, right? And that's an interesting frame. I'm fascinated by this notion that discernment, judgment, these processes are honed by experience and feedback, by the way, right? You have to finally know whether you won or lost that Go game. You have to finally have somebody say yes or no to your attempt, right? But then we do gain insight and judgment and discernment. And that's why historically wiser people are portrayed as older, right? Like wisdom has a component of age to some degree, just because it takes a bit of time to get that feedback loop going on something that, why is this the time agapically to call you out versus why is this the time agapically to be compassionate? I don't know why. I cannot articulate why, but I just know. And that's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, it's also important to remind ourselves again of the importance of, not bullshitting yourself and then being rational about your responses when you're trying to even exercise agape, right? Because you could say, well, I'm beating you for your own good. I believe this hurts me more than it hurts you, which is the whole, conceit of the, Inquisition, right? That whole agape went all the way to we're going to torture you to wash you of your sins, right? And, as the, molten lead was, shoved up the guy's ass, I'm like, believe me, this hurts me more than it hurts you, right? I'm being agapic here. So that entire thing could become pathologized really fast. And that, again, is the project of rationality, right? Where, you really, you become very aware of your own internal processes and ask yourself if you're really angry because you're being agapic or you're just pissed off because you're pissed off, right? And there's no agapic, you're just angry and you're being, irrational about it. Right. And that also, so you only get to discernment when you have enough command of your own faculties to make a conscious choice to allow the anger to come out because you think in this instance it's appropriate. Yes, I'm angry and I think it is appropriate to open the gates and let my anger show because I think that is the correct agapic move because it truly is for their best interest, right? And not to bullshit yourself into thinking, well, I'm only doing it for their own good, right? And it's the same thing for compassion, right? Because compassion can be a drug, right? It can be virtue signaling, right? Are you being compassionate because that's the correct move, or is it because you just want everyone to know what a nice person you are, right?
Or, and I mean, going back to your husband example, right? Is he doing that out of true compassion for his wife, or because it just makes his life easier and that's the fastest way to get her to shut up, right? And I don't have the fight, so let me just let her go off and whatever, right? And having the fight would be a long, drawn-out, emotionally draining process. And so it's not out of her best interest. It's not out of agapic love. It's out of self-love. It's out of self-interest, right? That I don't want to deal with it right now. So,
or you could say that he doesn't have the correct agapic orientation for the relationship, right? Which is what should be the orientation in that case, right? Again, you can't get there without the rational self-knowledge, right, of your own processes and then the conscious decision thereafter, which is why probably, in the early Christians, who were not necessarily embarked on projects of rationality, with the whole, story of St. Paul in the desert in Damascus, and then, he got blinded and the people took him in, and they were, they practiced the compassionate version of agape, right, because that was easier to proceduralize, right? Because if you're going to if you're going to be angry sometimes, and that is the correct posture, you have to have a lot of rational self-knowledge, and you have to be a truly wise person, right? But if Jesus just said, let's just turn your other cheek, right? Well, that's easy to like proceduralize. That's easy to propagate, right? And perhaps you'll be right about 80% of the time, right? Perhaps in Jesus' time, that was the correct posture, right? In a very tumultuous sort of Roman decline, the Roman Empire is kind of creaking and groaning and starting its decline. Maybe for him, seeing all the suffering that was happening, that was at that time the correct general posture to take. Just turn the other cheek. More times than not, that will be the right answer in that circumstance, right? But again, we're living in different times. We're not living in those times, and perhaps in terms of levels of wisdom, right? It would be the more wise thing to do to be self-reflective and then be very careful about when it is you show sternness, right, in the spirit of agape, right? And that would be a higher kind of agape, I would think, right? An agape of a higher state of a person than someone who just turns the other cheek all the time, right? And again, discernment, right? It's the very difficult thing, right, that we're all trying to get to. Well, I think this has been a very, very good lecture.
Yeah, actually,
I don't know if you had any
I actually would like to end with a poem.
Hit me.
We were talking about just the notion of operationalizing agape, and I just Gibran, of course, says, "You have been told that life is darkness, and in your weariness you echo what was said by the weary. And I say that life is indeed darkness, save when there is urge, and all urge is blind, save when there is knowledge, and all knowledge is vain, save when there is work, and all work is empty, save when there is love. And when you work with love, you bind yourself and to one another and to God. And what is it to work with love? It is to weave the cloth with threads drawn from your heart, even as if your beloved were to wear that cloth. It is to build a house with affection, even as if your beloved were to dwell in that house. It is to sow seeds with tenderness and reap the harvest with joy, even as if your beloved were to eat the fruit. It is to charge all things you fashion with a breath of your own spirit."
Good stuff. I need to read more Gibran.
Indeed. All right.
All right, buddy. Till next
Great
time.
lecture, man. Next time.
See you in the next one.